For our Did You Know segment today, we're going to talk about flood insurance. When you're out there shopping, you are going to see in maybe one town, you're going to see a disparity sometimes in the list prices. You may say, oh, wow, this house is a great deal. Go onto the listing, go onto realtor.com, homes.com, wherever it is that you shop, Zillow. You pop on there, you can scroll through. There's a risk factor section. This is an important thing to keep an eye out for, particularly if you are a prospective home buyer, and even more particularly if you are a prospective first-time home buyer. I'm not going to discourage you from buying a home in a flood zone, but there are implications both practically and monetarily if you're going to buy a home in a flood zone. So first and foremost, we have FEMA, and FEMA does offer flood insurance. This is a government-funded program for homes that are in flood zones. The cost in certain areas can be very, very high if you're going to need flood insurance. So FEMA outlines what areas are in what they consider flood zones, and that has implications for your financing. So if we are assisting you with your mortgage and we see that the property's in a flood zone, we are going to require, as the lender, flood insurance. Flood insurance could be very expensive. This is also something that can have an impact on your qualification. So whereas you may see a home price lower in a desired town, but it's in a flood zone, the cost component could be just as expensive or more than the homes that are not in the flood zone and what it would cost to be competitive to purchase those properties compared to the property that is in the flood zone. The cost variability runs the gamut. So if you have the FEMA flood insurance that you can get, that's going to be very expensive. But I would like to highlight that there are private flood insurance carriers out there that may be able to provide you the same protections at a lower cost. So making sure that you have the right insurance agent and the right insurance professional in your corner is extremely important. Obviously, even for homeowners insurance, but particularly if you're entertaining possibly buying a property in a flood zone, having an open conversation, open dialogue with your insurance professional about what those costs are before you place an offer. That's something that's part of my practice. The families and clients that I assist, I perform that due diligence on the front end before they even place an offer to identify. I can look it up very quickly and easily. I can identify if it's in a flood zone, and then I can connect them with the right insurance partner so that they can find what that cost is going to be, what that monthly payment's going to look like with that increased cost, and then they can make their decision on where an appropriate offer price would land. There is a little bit of a rising risk of floods nationally because of water tables adjusting, and that's kind of where like water normally is, and that is increasing. There's varying opinions on the reasons for this. I won't get into that. What we're talking about is what are we having to manage on our end here as a prospective buyer, as a real estate professional in this market. So keeping an eye out for if a property that maybe wasn't in a flood zone 5-10 years ago, maybe it's in a flood zone now. Notices typically go out to the homeowners that are in these areas, particularly if it gets designated as a flood zone after not being in a flood zone for a period of time. And then also the flood zones, if you look at the flood zone maps, they're not necessarily just taking lumps of land and properties and saying, oh, that address is in a flood zone. It's actually drawn out on a map based upon the history and the data of flooding that has occurred over 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 50, 100-year flood zone, flood plains is what they call it. And you can see that on the FEMA flood maps. The tools that I use, I get to take a look, and I'll share just a quick example of a client I was assisting this past week who was interested in placing an offer on a property. For those of you here in North Jersey, it was a property in Montclair. And there was, from what I saw, there was a portion of the property, and it was like the southeast corner of the parcel. So the meets and bounds of the property dictate where the parcel of land is that you are purchasing. There was a little corner portion that was in the flood zone. The structure itself was not in a flood zone. But if it's on the property line, that's something you need to talk to an insurance professional about, which is what I did. I connected that client with my preferred insurance professional so that they can ask the questions, find out what the costs are. The last thing that I'll mention is we're talking about when flood insurance is mandatory, when the property is in a flood zone. But a lot of people don't know you can get additional flood insurance policies that are voluntary. So let's say your property's not in a flood zone, but maybe you know from the prior owner that there was, a couple random times where there was water in the basement for whatever reason. Maybe it's just poor drainage in a particular neighborhood that when there's a lot of rain, like we saw last year here in North Jersey, there was, a couple months of just nonstop rain and some areas were flooding that don't normally flood. Well, you can get a voluntary flood insurance policy. This will then be at a much more reduced premium because it's not in a mandatory zone and it's not in a FEMA designated flood area. So your premium could be pretty low and provide you with some protection in the event maybe that there's water damage from flooding for whatever reason. So it's something important to think about as you're shopping. And if you're a real estate professional, this is good information to share with clients so that you can kind of help them manage their expectations properly as they're shopping. A lot of people in the market right now, I'll get hyper-local again here in North Jersey, inventory's still low. It's still super competitive. So people start, let's just say, opening up what their expectations are. And let's say they're going to get a little bit more liberal with their options. They may start entertaining flood zones. These are some important things to realize. And these are all numbers that we're talking about. Another part of it is if it's in a flood zone and it does flood, there's a practical element of what's going to be required to make sure you're keeping your home maintained, getting rid of the water, any remediation for mold, things like that. So these are all things that are important to consider, especially if you're possibly open to purchasing a property in a flood zone.